The Dead Space games are a series of iterations. Each has basically the same core gameplay model as its two sisters. They're action horror shooters where you weaken your enemies by cutting off their extremities. They control basically the same, they look basically the same, and they all feature the same kinds of monsters. But while the first two games were two of the best third-person shooters out there, Dead Space 3 is nothing but a fucking mess. It has the same basic mechanics that its predecessors used to their advantage, but it feels like Visceral decided to just phone it in and mash together things they had already made with no real regard for what it all meant. Apart from a different setting and visual improvements, it looks just like the two games before it, like a game that you'd enjoy if you enjoyed the first two, or a game that you'd hate if you hated the first two. But it has none of the creativity and nuance that helped put them above any other regular monster shooter. Presentation-wise, the game takes a few steps in the right direction at least, but they do balance out with the awful narrative. Dead Space 2 pretty much lacked all of the rich world-building that Dead Space 1 had, and it decided to make the whole story about Isaac Clarke and his fake Canadian girlfriend instead of recognizing that this minor part of a much larger universe was basically concluded at the end of Dead Space 1. Dead Space 3 makes a genuine attempt to provide substance to the Dead Space universe as it puts you on what feels like an archaeological expedition to what's considered the mIRC homeworld, an ice planet where the necromorph infestation is said to originate, and there's a fair amount of thoughtful backstory to learn and explore. I'm not familiar with the graphic novels or films, so I can't speak to its consistency with the Dead Space universe as a whole, but what the game provides definitely overshadows Dead Space 2's complete lack of narrative complexity. On the other hand, though, the writing and story progression are so bad that they render any praise I might have for the rest of the story completely moot. Isaac is back, and this time he's on a mission to deal with his real Canadian girlfriend, and of course also stop the necromorph infestation and the unitologist extremists, but first and foremost to deal with his real Canadian girlfriend. The way the game handles romance is cringeworthy at best, and it's never even anywhere near its best. There's a stupid love triangle going on between Isaac, his girlfriend, and Robert, her new boyfriend, and everybody is a passive-aggressive dick to everybody else, near completely oblivious to the actual mission they're on.
See, you made it, Isaac. Maybe we should give you two some time alone, huh?
What the hell does that mean?
It means, for someone who's in the past, you're awfully glad to see him.
The villain is a religious fanatic who argues like a YouTube commenter, and the only characters who have any interest in the mission and the history of the markers take secondary roles and then die off to show that the situation is serious. Minutes after they die, focus shifts back to the main character's reluctance to have a threesome. What's probably the most damning to Dead Space 3's story, though, is the way it mishandles the co-op companion. Isaac's cute new friend John has considerably less experience dealing with markers, so he experiences visions of his fake Canadian son that Isaac can't see. That would be kind of cool if it made players feel like they were deceiving each other or something, but it doesn't go so far. It's basically the same thing that the first two games did with Isaac, but this time with a slightly different theme. If you aren't playing in co-op mode, John just disappears. He shows up in opening segments to insult Isaac for whatever reason, and then he just fucks right off. He teleports into a few cutscenes to remind Isaac that he exists, but otherwise he's completely absent. Lots of co-op shooters don't go nearly as far as Dead Space 3 to incorporate stories for all the playable characters, but Dead Space 3 just stops in an uncomfortable, uncanny valley where both the co-op and single-player modes fail to provide anything compelling at all about their better half. But Dead Space 2 showed that, like in most other shooters, the narrative in a Dead Space game can be unimaginably stupid and the game can still turn out to be a hell of a lot of fun. But that's provided that shooting is fun, and in Dead Space 3, pretty much everything that made its predecessors fun is ripped out. The common approach to a game about shooting monsters is to spawn a few dumb enemies at a time and just have you beat them down without putting much thought into your violence. This design philosophy produces games like Doom 3, Condemned Criminal Origins, and other games for white boys. The Dead Space games avoided the problems of really stupid monster combat thanks to the highly touted strategic dismemberment mechanic and a great variety of enemies. Enemies were still dumb and they didn't spawn in large numbers, but they approached in varied groups in different positions. They had different attacks depending on their injuries, and they all had different weak spots. Dead Space 1 and 2 pushed a style of combat that relied on situational awareness and the proper use of distinct weapons. It was combat for real men. Antisocial, fat men, of course, but men nonetheless. And for the sake of perspective, before I start bashing Dead Space 3 at its core, I'm going to provide some footage of Dead Space 2. In this particular monster encounter, I'm on a catwalk in a multi-level room, and enemies are spawning on both levels. I'm faced with razor-armed necromorphs that rely entirely on melee attacks, pukers that can fling bile and vomit on me to slow me down, and tentacle monster babies that stay back and fire tiny projectiles at me. The razors and pukers spawn at different parts of the catwalk as I cross it, and the tentacle babies sit back and fire from the lower level. The razors' attacks can stun me, and the pukers' vomit can slow me down for a while, making me an easy target for the tentacle babies. The babies are the farthest away, and they're ideally the first to go so the pukers don't pose as big a threat and make me an easy target, but the razors move pretty fast and the catwalk is narrow, so I can't just ignore them while I try to aim at the more distant targets. Perhaps it's best just to avoid the babies' projectiles and disable the more prominent enemies on my level first. This encounter is admittedly not the most remarkable thing, and there are numerous parts of both Dead Space games that are much more exciting, but it exemplifies their strengths very well. This situation and just these three enemy types interplay in a way that makes Dead Space 2's combat model thoughtful and mouth-watering. But Dead Space 3 doesn't feature that sort of interplay. It has the same enemies, but it doesn't rely on intricacies in enemy variety, weapon specialization, or environment design. Instead, it relies almost entirely on brute force to pose any sort of challenge, and what's even worse is that a lot of the time it fails to provide that challenge at all. The staple Dead Space enemy is the razor-armed necromorph, and now by extension its ice-pick-wielding buddy who's introduced in this installment. These two guys show up in lots of encounters throughout the game, but what's noteworthy is that, unlike their predecessors, they don't like to bring friends along to help them fight. Loads of enemy encounters are entirely about the razors and the ice picks, the two simplest, least specialized enemies in the game. It feels like the developers didn't understand the importance of having enemies who play different roles when attacking you. Some encounters will incorporate other enemies, but so rarely do they feature more than two types of necromorphs. Each arena just likes to spawn the razors or the ice picks, or the pukers, or the tentacle babies. This behavior really undermines the need to prioritize targets and swap weapons at a moment's notice. All the bad guys at nearly any given moment are either the same or very similar, so they all have the same attacks, the same movement patterns and speed, and the same weak spots. While it's still recommended practice to lop off enemies' limbs, the fun of mixing things up that came with having to deal with all sorts of enemies is pretty much gone. Cutting off limbs becomes conceptually indistinguishable from just aiming for the head in any other shooter, and since the core combat isn't about large swarms of enemies or smart AI or anything else substantial, it leaves you with mostly trivial monster encounters. Another problem caused by the lack of enemy variety in individual encounters is that the more specialized backup sort of enemies are just completely ignored for ridiculous periods of time. There were some instances where Dead Space 3 actually managed to shock me, but not because its crappy horror element managed to get under my skin. No, it surprised me whenever it finally remembered that about half its enemy roster still existed after chapters of disuse. The flying necromorphs with whip-like tails, the pregnant necromorphs that spew baby monsters, and the screaming guys with large explosive sacks for hands all have extremely long spells of unemployment in favor of whatever enemy is easier for swarming in larger numbers. Do you remember the exploding babies introduced in Dead Space 2? If you're unfamiliar, imagine miniature exploding barrels that hobble toward you in the midst of volatile combat environments, and if you're a good enough shot, you can kill them cleanly and use your telekinesis to pick them up and launch them back at your enemies. This time around, in a game with 19 chapters, they aren't reintroduced until the 16th fucking chapter, where they're mainly employed in swarms that appear in a terrible rock climbing minigame. An interesting addition to the enemy roster is the Unitologist Extremist enemy, introduced because Unitologists are bad people, and of course we have to show that by having them shoot at you. All the twisted backstory and suicide pacts and devil worship just aren't enough. Their behavior amounts to sticking behind cover and shooting at you, but surprisingly, Dead Space 3 manages to avoid this one nail in its coffin. Extremist encounters are few and far between. They're so excessively easy that you don't need to use the tacked-on cover system at all, and they're often interrupted by necromorph attacks anyway. From the gunfight footage I saw before the game's release, I was suspicious that something would go wrong, but as it turns out, the human enemies are the least of this game's problems. The weapon system has taken an overhaul for the worse. The new weapon modification interface is actually okay, since it uses basically the same systems as the original 2 games did, but with a new coat of paint and a bit more customization, but the weapons themselves are a joke. All the regular Dead Space dismemberment tools are still present in the game, but Dead Space 3 introduces assault rifles and shotguns and other military weapons. Since the game is about cutting off limbs, it sounds ridiculous at first, but as it turns out, guns that fire lead projectiles are actually more efficient than any cutting tool at cutting off limbs, so it's really even more ridiculous. The inclusion of these weapons puts a clear hierarchy on the weapon roster, with them straight at the top. Add to this the matter that all of the ammunition you find is universal, and you never have to equip a specialized weapon as a result. The real huge game-ruining problem with the weapon hierarchy, though, isn't that the military weapons are the most useful, but that after a while the cutting tools become mostly useless. They probably have a better effect on enemies at lower difficulty levels, but in any Dead Space game, anything below the so-called impossible difficulty is so easy. And even impossible mode this time around just shovels medkits and ammo and slow-motion power-ups into your inventory. Roughly 2/3 of the way through, when Dead Space 3 starts throwing the crusty enemies at you, which are tougher versions of regular necromorphs, all of the cutting weapons become ridiculously underpowered. I'm not sure whether it's a problem with the hit detection or just a lack of proper enemy animations, but crusty enemies aren't even animated enough to visibly shrug off the impact of a rocket, or a fully upgraded circular saw blade shooting through their legs. In impossible mode, they take ridiculous amounts of time to kill with pretty much any weapon that isn't a shotgun or a carbine rifle. Most of the time, the game is stupidly easy, but because of instances where regular weapons have such little power over tougher enemies, the rare alternative to stupidly easy is nothing but stupidly hard. The problem with enemy health likely originates from the sloppy implementation of cooperative play. Apart from a few weapon attachments that buff both players for some reason, the single difference between the 2-player co-op mode and the single player is that 2 players do more damage per second than 1. And there's no rebalancing of anything based on whether or not you have a buddy playing with you. There's just the one campaign script that doesn't change at all in regard to spawns, enemy health, or loot, no matter whom you're playing with. On top of that, anything that managed to be hard in the single player is trivialized in co-op simply by the amount of damage that 2 players can deal anyway, even though the crusty enemies are so obviously buffed with the intention of providing some sort of challenge during co-op. A noteworthy boast that I've encountered about Dead Space 3 is that it features a campaign that lasts about 20 hours, almost double that of either of its predecessors, but the fact of the matter is that the campaign contains the regular 10 to 12 hours of content, stretched over 20 hours of completely transparent dungeon repetition. A good portion of the entire campaign is made up of newly introduced side missions that yield small rewards in the forms of loot and backstory. The problem is that these side missions are either entirely copy-pasted from other parts of the base game, or just tacked on with absolutely no thought put into their design. The absolute nadir of the game's level design is a side mission set in some sewer or garbage facility that's nothing but a succession of extremely small, cramped rooms crowded with the toughest, least interesting enemies in the game. Some of these side missions are also actually restricted to co-op only, even though they don't feature any mechanics that necessitate 2 players. They're just some of the exact same levels you've seen before with different set dressing. This is easily some of the laziest level design I've seen in a single-player shooter in a long time. Another way the game pads itself out is with ridiculous door mechanisms that take a surprising amount of time. No longer can you just press your context action key to open a door. You have to use telekinesis to rotate a wheel. You have to play Simon Says with alien passwords. You have to play a lockpicking minigame with your co-op buddy. This sounds inconsequential because none of these events are time-consuming, but they happen with such frequency and offer nothing that they become extremely laborious. Dead Space 3 looks like its predecessors in that it's full of bloodied monsters who jump out at you from vents and fall over when you shoot off their extremities. But apart from the inclusion of its fairly unique core mechanic, it's lacking in every single way. Its rare moments of creative design are overshadowed by the terrible weapon imbalance and the squads of one enemy type that it sends your way frequently. There's no reliance on situational awareness anymore. You don't need to prioritize targets or use different weapons depending on the situation. You just need to shoot small groups of enemies that jump out at you. For the overwhelming majority of the game, there's nothing more to it than that. The same solid Dead Space idea of enemy dismemberment is still there, but the execution of it is flawed, the co-op is tacked on and detrimental to the game's balance, and the campaign contains so much lazy filler and grating, annoying storytelling that it would definitely bring the game down, even if the shooting was actually good. The magic and care put into the original Dead Space has stayed in the original Dead Space.
She wanted to turn it off. She wrote that over and over again like a mantra.
Isaac's.
Turn it off.
Hey, Isaac.
Turn it
Isaac?
off.
Carver, what's going on?
Turn it off.
Isaac.
Turn
Hey.
it off. Turn it off.
Hey!